So we know that now more than ever it's really, really important to explore what wellbeing really means and what it looks like. Yesterday I was at an event, people were talking about the Great Resignation. So we know that in terms of making sure that you're keeping people within your company, you're able to carry on recruiting people, that we really need to get wellbeing right. And we're going to be focusing today on managers, because they tend to get the brunt of lots of blame. They tend to have a lot put on their shoulders, and it's a big task, and a lot of managers are feeling slightly out their depth. So we want to explore that. This is not a webinar, as we're proud to say. So there are no slides. You just get Richard and I talking about this. But we want to really open this up into a wider conversation. So we are not going to be talking at you. We're going to be having a conversation about some of the stuff that we know is an issue, and some of the ways that people are getting around it within companies. But we'd love for you to be able to ask your questions, to share your insights, share your challenges, what's working, what's not, that kind of thing. Because of the numbers, we were thinking about just actually having people just kind of, shout out if you want to say something, but it might be easier if you put your hand up on the bottom of your screen, where you've got reactions. You should be able to, if you click on that, you should be able to raise your hand. And then we've got the lovely Matt on this call as well, who will shout out and also use the chat box. So if you've got your hand up, then hopefully Matt or Richard or I will see that. So just before I hand over to Richard, just to let those of you who don't know me know a bit more about me, I'm a chartered psychologist and I'm a psychotherapist, and I work with companies with their leadership teams and their wider workforce in terms of employee well-being and engagement, and actually the whole well-being or the whole employee experience now. So it's much more than what people tend to think of as mental health and well-being, which tends to be a very narrow view of it, and much more around the ability for people to go to work and feel good about what they do and who they work with and where they are, particularly during such a time of uncertainty and change that we're going through. So Richard, can I hand over to you to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Lisa, and afternoon, everyone. So yeah, quick introduction for myself. I'm Richard Lucas. I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO of GoVox Wellbeing. I'm not going to give you the hard sell on GoVox Wellbeing. Please feel free to go online and check us out. We're an online wellbeing platform that support a range of organisations. We started in the sports world, and a lot of what we'll talk about today, I might pull back some of the kind of the connections to the sporting world. And our founding story actually starts in a bit of a dark place around mental health and suicide. However, very much linked into Lisa's approach and the conversation today, the solution that we like to take is all around happiness, engagement and fulfillment, and helping connect people in doing so, identify who needs support and then help deliver some of that support through. So really excited to kind of jump on today's non-webinar with everybody. We know everyone's a bit tired of webinars and kind of, do you know what, it kept us busy through the lockdown, didn't it? It gave us a chance to kind of connect out to people. But if we want to jump on another webinar and go through a load of slides, probably not. We just want to have a rich conversation and share our experiences. And they are just experiences, they're observations, they're things that we've picked up over the years working in this space. And we hope to take as much away from this session as everybody that's joined us, because we will open it up for everybody to chip in. And please feel free to chip in when you want. There's no kind of point in time that you need to wait to interrupt us. So we're going to talk a bit about, there's three areas we're going to cover off. So a good guy once told me you have to do things in three. So we're going to cover off three key things. So a bit of talk about the current climate, obviously post-pandemic, but there's a lot of things that are happening in the world before coronavirus that have a huge impact on well-being and the need for people to focus on well-being in organisations. So we'll have a bit of a chat about that. We're going to look at about the role of the manager or the leader, the person that's kind of leading the frontline teams in whatever capacity that may be. And that's where I'll probably pull in some comparisons to my kind of sporting experience, the kind of the coach of the team, kind of pulling everyone together. And then also kind of a layer above that, the role of leaders. So leaders in organisations, What's their role in all of this? And there is no perfect answer. There is a direction in which that people are travelling, and well-being is becoming a lot hotter on the topic and on the agenda. And it's something that's new to some. It's something that other organisations have embraced for a long time, and we can look to learn from the best examples and maybe also learn from some of the poor ones as well. So, Lisa, a little bit back over to you, really, on our kind of to me to you. For those of a certain age on the call, it might sound a bit Chuckle Brothers, but back to Lisa, just kind of open the conversation really about what you see around the current climate today, kind of post-pandemic, but also kind of pulling in kind of what was going on in the world before we had such a word as lockdown and all of those fun things we've been through.
I think it's there's a Gallup, some research recently which suggested that only about 80% or as many as 80% of employees are not engaged at work. And I think that's really playing out in companies now. And I know, having spoken to lots of leaders, and we see it with all the data around vacancies and all the issues around recruitment and retention, that people are now really voting with their feet. And if they're not looked after well enough within their company, so if they don't feel that they are being put first, they are walking and they're pushing back. And people are no longer in a position where they're grateful to have a job. There's that sense of, actually, at one time people just wanted to be satisfied at work, and they were just basically then be engaged at work. And now it's about much more the whole experience.
Yeah.
And that whole experience, I think, for me, and from what Lisa's saying, is actually people need to just really enjoy being at work, and they need to feel able to be themselves and to be really, really authentic.
Absolutely. I mean, there was a time, and I'm of a certain age, Lisa's obviously a lot younger than me, but there was a time where the first thing you looked at the job, and probably the only thing, is how much they're going to pay me. That's probably the approach that I had when I was younger and I was looking at going into a career. It was kind of like the pay, and then it was maybe pay and conditions, and kind of there was a bit of stuff around that. I just think socially, attached to what we see in the workplace, there was a blog that we put out there a few months ago about kind of the well-being through the ages. And I go right back to kind of like the 70s, and I called it this kind of sweep it under the carpet generation. So back then, if there was a problem, you didn't talk about it. And that's a problem in the workplace, that's a problem at home, that's within your family. It was kind of like sweep it under the carpet generation. And crikey, we don't have to go into kind of what's gone on in the world in recent years around some of the stuff that happened around that generation. But following on from that, it kind of, for me, it kind of morphed into the kind of the 80s was kind of the loads of money generation. It was all around your material worth. How much money did you have in your pocket? How fast was your car? How big was your house? And that drove that kind of workplace environment, that it was all about the money. It was all around kind of how much money you're going to earn from this job, from the hours you're going to put in. Moving through from there and keeping it really quickly, you get into the kind of the 90s, the internet was born. I didn't even know there was such thing as a six-pack, and suddenly I had to have one. For the record, I've never had one, but because you start to see images and social media tells you that you need to behave a certain way and life needs to be a certain way, that's driven a kind of an issue in a lot of people, that actually they started to realise that they weren't particularly happy with themselves or their environment or all of the things around them, and that we saw that kind of play out into the workplace. I remember very early days where a well-being day at work in large organisations and small was everybody got a bottle of water and an apple. Like, tick the box, we've got to do a well-being day, let's keep everyone hydrated, and if we eat more fruit, we're going to be healthier. And that was a strategic well-being day back in the days. And as we move through to kind of pre and post pandemic, before the pandemic, we were seeing, and GoVox was created ahead of the pandemic, we were seeing a much bigger movement for people to have that workplace environment that not only paid them their worth, but also gave them the environment in which that they could flourish as individuals and be the best version of themselves, and focus on the individual and make sure that those conversations were kind of born through. So I think the workplace has very much followed society. I think Ollie's just mentioned there that the fruit bowl strategy still exists in a lot of organisations. I giggle about it a bit because I don't like fruit as well. So actually, it was never a thing for me. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Ollie. It does still exist in society today that you think, right, okay. And for me, it's the fruit bowl is the tick box exercise. It's kind of what's the 101 we can do around well-being in an environment. So, Lisa, I don't know what you've kind of seen kind of with the work that you do around the workplace organisations, moving from that kind of tick box. Because to be fair, with the quality of stuff that you deliver, organisations that engage with you, they've kind of already decided that an orange and a bottle of water is not going to cut it. So what have you seen kind of move organisations into that fresh space?
Well, I think it's really interesting, isn't it? Because there are, like Ollie was saying, there are still lots of companies who still just tick the box and they think that's it. And I think those are the ones who are going to be fine. They don't have a workforce in the future because people are going to walk. The ones who are taking it seriously are invested in putting their people first, but often don't know how. And they might zoom in on the what I think of as the detail. So let's have a mental health and wellbeing day, or let's have a mental health bulletin, or let's have this particular initiative. But which is much more wholesome than a bowl of fruit in one sense, but it's still very much a tick box exercise because it's not changing practice on a day-to-day basis. And so I think where companies are really looking at what makes a difference and realizing, there's some data that I think as many as 7 in 10 employees were suggesting that they are struggling right now. So if you take data like that and come to say, actually, we want to do something different about this, they're looking at the big picture in terms of when people come to work, are their values aligned with our values? Like, what are our values? Like, what are we trying to build here? What are we focusing on here? And people don't tend to think of values to do with stuff to do with mental health and wellbeing, or everything going on with change and uncertainty. And Amanda, who's on this call, and she and I do quite a lot of stuff around supporting leadership teams on that journey of what does a company go through when they're going through change? What are employees experiencing with uncertainty? It has a massive impact on their behaviour, and there's apparently appearing to be awkward and defensive, and they're just the people that we want to shy away from, whereas actually they're the people we need to spend more time with. So I think where leaders and where leaders are really on the ball with, actually, we need to make a bigger difference and a real difference, they're looking at their wider culture, they're looking at the whole organisation. Does their organisation have, is it based on psychological safety? Are people empowered to be able to be their best? So is this somewhere that people feel included and feel safe to be themselves? Mental health and wellbeing, another study was suggesting that fewer than half of employees who have a challenge with mental health and wellbeing are able to or want to admit that to the line manager for fear of repercussions. And so there's still a stigma. And even though people are talking about it so much more, there is still a stigma. So we can say, well, let's talk about mental health and wellbeing, and that's very specific. But unless it's within a culture that's modelled by leadership about, if you open up and are vulnerable about whatever it might be, whether it's I've made a mistake, or whether it's something to do with my mental health, or I don't know something, depending on your response, that will entirely shape what happens next.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just picking up on a couple of comments in the chat box as well. So just going back to a comment from, I'm just going to have to scroll up, just checking who it was. Ollie, yeah. Just there's only 11% of businesses have even heard of a mental health first aider. And we know that mental health first aider is a kind of brand name for having somebody within the organisation trained up on mental health. And you're absolutely right, Ollie, that the number of organisations that aren't even aware of those additional roles. If we worked in a workplace together and we had that joyous time that we can all physically be together in an office, that it would not even be a thing that one of us wouldn't be the physical first aider. If there was 20 people working in an office together, if all the people on this call worked in a physical workspace together, one of us would have that luminous jacket on the back of our chair. We would have gone on some training, and we would have been we would have been trained in physical first aid. That's the given now. What we're starting to see, and it is only a small number of organisations, is that extra investment in the mental health first aid, or whatever level of training gives somebody that ability. Now, there's a couple of things that we do within with organisations that we work with GoVox is actually going back to what you were saying there, Lisa, and what we started with the kind of the apple and the water kind of tick box strategy is actually identifying what each individual needs, not just treating everybody as a collective. And we use the example that a lot of organisations, I know this month we're going to do some hints and tips on sleeping better. So they've moved on from the tick box exercise of a bottle of water and apple, and they realise that there are some particular things that people, if they're given support in, can be better versions of themselves within the workplace and within their daily life. But what we actually found, and it's part of the reason why GoVox exists, is that we found that organisations were starting to do those out in a kind of a very blanket fashion. So if in February I work for an organisation and they're doing some, and it's kind of sleeping better month, well, I might be sleeping fine, thanks. And actually the real dangerous thing there is that I then switch off to the next month theme that might be important to me. It might be about eating better because, you know what, I need to lose a bit of weight. So that might be a great one for me. But the problem we've got is that we're all so time poor in technology. We just flick through emails and messages stuff now, that if something isn't relevant the first time, I'm not going to engage with it the second time. And that's something that we really focus on within the GoVox kind of delivery that we do, is kind of really understanding people on an individual level. Because going back to, and there's been a couple of comments on there as well, like when Roy joined at entry level, agreeing that it's about the salary, but the kind of bigger picture, to attract the right talent in an organisation now, you need to have the complete picture. And not all organisations have realised that they can afford to pay bigger and bigger wages, because that becomes a challenge for the organisation. So it's about what you do around it. So okay, it's a given that you're going to have a decent pension, maybe. It's a given that you're going to have some kind of EAP, you're going to have kind of some kind of access to healthcare, etc., etc. But where is that next kind of layer? And that's where we're getting into now, around that holistic kind of well-being approach about an individual. And that's kind of moving on to kind of post-pandemic, really. And I think, look, let's take the good out of any crisis. The pandemic was a terrible experience for everybody globally. But I think it's accelerated a lot of organisations thinking around this area. They knew they had a problem. All of the statistics were telling them that they had a problem. And I talk about 3 years ago when we were founded, we were in what I call the statistical stage of mental health and wellbeing. I remember reading reports myself around suicide being the biggest killer of men between the ages of 25 and 45. I was bang in that age group. But my approach up until that point could probably be summed up with man up. Everyone has a bad day, mate, get over yourself. Because I was a product of my time, and I think the pandemic has accelerated that. So if we're talking about the current climate, we are getting a lot more organisations and leaders and managers open to, do you know what, I need to have a different set of skills. I need to have a different toolbox available to me to meet that need for my people, to attract the right talent, to keep my talent, and also to create the right environment for myself. And we'll come on to the role of the manager. And actually, that role has been quite beaten up over the years, I think.
I think it's interesting how with HR and their role, they've there's some research came across recently which was talking about, companies have put in place all these benefits, and all that, they got the pensions and they got the health insurance and so on, and they think that that's what employees want. But actually, when you ask the employees, they want something quite different. And there's a real mismatch. And I think where companies are then starting to look at what is it that they're offering, and what is it that actually is being sought from the employees, they're not very well aligned quite often. And I think it's really interesting what you were saying, Richard, about mental health first aiders, because I have, depending on how they're used in companies, I think sometimes they can be great and sometimes they're not, because they, and I love what you're talking about in terms of, like, there might be a kind of a campaign 1 month around sleep, and there might be something else, they're wider than just their role of, I'm sitting, everyone knows who I am and I'm sitting in my room waiting for people to come to me. Because I know some companies are very proud of the fact they have lots of mental health first aiders, but they don't fit into the big strategy. There is no strategy.
Absolutely.
And I still remember a time when I was talking with running a workshop with a group of leaders who had been on mental health first aid training courses, and like we're ready to go. And then you ask the really obvious questions like, you know, how does it fit into your strategy? How do people know about you? How are you going to measure impact? And how you can break down the barriers and so on. And they were like, oh, I don't know. We haven't thought about all that. And it's that typical thing of, I'm just going to add the kind of the bolt on. But it's something we need to address, because we haven't got the big picture right, joining the dots, like what is everyone's role within a company? What's their role? What's their responsibility toward creating that culture? James made a comment earlier about when you get a label, it sticks. Well, that very much depends on the culture you're in. So some people who say, actually, you know what, I've got a diagnosis of whatever, or I'm struggling with whatever, actually, depending what company you're in, that can empower other people to say, you know what, I'm actually struggling with that too. And it's something, it becomes a safe place to be very honest and very authentic about who you are. Whereas some companies open up and say, I'm struggling with such and such, then yeah, it doesn't go down well. But that very much comes back to the big picture.
Absolutely. And Mark and Amanda are kind of moving us through in the chat to our kind of next area of focus around the manager, and actually to the leaders in organisation, the managers of people kind of struggle because their own well-being is under pressure, or they're struggling. And we'll come to that in a second, but I just wanted to close off the kind of the bit around the current climate around, and Jill's made the comment there around the mental health first aider in many organisations being a tick box. And you're absolutely right. What we're finding is that, and you mentioned it there, Lisa, that sometimes you see it work brilliantly. In most cases, we find that organisations come to us when they've invested in mental health first aiders, which is brilliant for both the organisation and the individual. Because using my same analogy with the physical first aider, if we have someone in our group that's going to step up and go and do that extra bit of training, that's not only a cost to the business, but it's also a cost to their individual time as well. And I always credit people that kind of like, do you know what, I could just carry on doing my role at work, but you know what, I'm going to go and get this extra set of skills. But then what we're finding is that they then come back into the workplace and they've almost sit there kind of like, well, what's the point in doing that? Because nobody, who do I talk to? It's not a visible thing. And I talk to organisations around, if you've got a physical first aider in the room and someone walks in and trips over and bangs their arm, they know they're needed. They can jump into work and they can put those skills into practice. If it's a bump and a scratch, they're trained to that. If the person's broken their arm, they're not trained to that level, but they can get on the phone to the experts. And I use exactly the same example with the mental health first aider. Once you've trained them, and mental health first aider is a brand title for that training. Once you've got someone in your organisation that has said, and credit to them, has said, you know what, I want to have these extra tools that can mean that I can help others around me. You need to give them the tools to then give them the visibility of the trips and the falls, because otherwise they only get the cases when they're broken arms. They only get the cases when someone's gone off sick and it's become too difficult. And I think we will move the conversation on to the kind of the role of the manager. And I'm a big advocate of that manager, that person. I think that they've had a lot put on their shoulders over the years. And in a lot of organisations, I see wellbeing support as that next hat that they're being asked to wear, having had no training in it, having just maybe become a manager through, I call it dead man's shoes, but kind of like they were the best person in the team to take over when the previous manager moved on. They're now responsible for people. What does that mean? Well, what it doesn't mean is you don't get extra hours in the day. You don't get a magic power that means you can read people's minds. You don't get a sixth sense that means you can kind of delve into people. And quite often your own mental health and well-being can be really heavily impacted because you worry a lot about others. You worry about how you can support others. You read things into things that maybe aren't even there when somebody, because sometimes it might be a performance issue and it's not a well-being issue, and you kind of really challenge yourself with that. So if we move on to our second kind of piece within today's conversation, kind of Lisa, what's your view on that?
We've got two hands raised before we move on. Amanda, did you want to go first?
Yeah, unless Ollie was, but
I'm sorry.
I don't know if anybody's done the mental health first aider training. I had the opportunity to do it. Somebody who was training to be a mental health first aider trained the trainer, and I thought, oh, this would be interesting. And I did it, and I found out I had a mental health problem. So I laugh, not because it's funny. I laugh because I found it really, really helpful for me personally. I mean, it was towards the front end of the book, I have to say, not the back end of the book. But I found it really helpful, and it helped me manage my own sort of mental health as well, because I think it went to a level that perhaps mental health or wellbeing training doesn't touch. It's just more medically backed up with facts and so on and so forth. But the point I was trying to make is that wouldn't it be great, so this is me visioning, wouldn't it be great if we could work with organizations and it's the manager's role to be the mental health. So as a result of them going, it's a requirement that they go for it. And then you're killing sort of two birds with one stone then. You're giving them that awareness about themselves, but also having some empathy and understanding and awareness of others. Just a thought.
I think it's a really interesting one. And I think there could be lots of advantages to that. I think for me, my caution around that would be you've got to have the right people wanting to engage with that, because there are so many managers who don't want to have those conversations at all. And if they are having to have that and the expectations on them to have those, and they're not the right people to have those conversations, they could inadvertently do more damage than good. In an ideal world, if all the managers had the right conversation skills and so on, then I think, I think taking that point a bit broader, actually managers having the right skill set to have the right conversations and to know how to have those conversations without necessarily it being about mental health per se, but it's kind of about, I see you're struggling or you don't see your usual self. I think that goes a long way.
Yeah. And Amanda, you're absolutely right. I mean, I was listening to you there, and I think it's about awareness. It's about awareness. So, I mean, please feel free to go online and look at the GoVox founding story on our website. But we're a mental health and wellbeing digital platform. Until 3 years ago, I didn't realise. Well, I was your kind of man up kind of approach to mental health and wellbeing. I didn't realise that I've got elements around my mental health that I've probably needed support over the years and haven't had. I've got behavioural traits that I can now channel more positively. I'm a massive obsessive. I didn't really realise what that meant to others around me and what it meant to my mental health without having coping mechanisms to kind of put that in a positive way and understand when it goes wrong and how I can kind of pull back from it and support my own happiness and my own well-being. That's only through awareness piece, and very similar to yourself, it was going on a course about me being able to support others. And I spent the whole course thinking, well, who's going to be supporting me? Because I was actually feeling all right, because I'd actually, like most people, I'd kind of built that resilience over time and experiences, and I probably felt a little bit nervous that I was opening a Pandora's box of like, oh crikey, now I'm going to have to go and lie on a couch and talk to somebody. And that's because of my own naivety around my own mental health and well-being. You're absolutely right. And I think it's right that you mentioned there that it'd be great for managers to kind of go on. And when we say managers, we're really talking about people with responsibility for others. It's not a job type. It's just people that have got responsibility for others. I think it's great for them to go on some kind of awareness course. I probably challenge whether they are the ones that maybe need to have the broad shoulders to be the well-being support within the organisation. And I'll use a sporting analogy for you. My background in sport is rugby. It's a great team sport. If you're the coach of the rugby team or the team manager, you're not the physio as well, because it's very difficult to manage a team and run a game as it is to look after somebody's physical health. And I know I'm using physical health again as an example. And sometimes you can make some poor decisions. I've been at the point where I've been coaching a rugby team, and is the result of that game more important than the fact that there's a player that's probably my star player who's got a little bit of an injury, probably best if he came off from a medical point of view, but if he really pushed through, we could win this game. I need the medical person to make that decision. and to do that support and to make sure that the right support is there. And again, kind of pulling forward the rugby kind of analogy of that, you've only got to look at what's happening now within that sport around concussion. They've taken the decision away from the team coaches and managers and the individual themselves, and an independent doctor makes that decision as to whether that player is removed from the game or not. Imagine if we could apply that principle to mental health and well-being, not just on the rugby pitch, but in life, that you had broader shoulders and more people qualified, trained, experienced to make decisions that aren't at the cost of another decision around performance or result, but actually is around the individual's safety for themselves, because they will be better in the future. Again, dragging out the analogy, that individual player, we might win that game today, but they might be out for the next 6 months. It might be the end of their career if you push them to that point.
Richard, I'm going to move on to Ollie's because he's had his hand up very patiently.
Oh,
I tell you what, Richard, you remind me of someone I know called Stuart Carroll, who can use sporting analogies non-stop for hours, and I'm going to have to interrupt you. Ollie, go for it.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Richard. And I think what I was going to say probably broaches the first part of what we're talking about and leading on to the second. I think one of the dividends of the pandemic is that mental health awareness has probably raised up the agenda a bit. So actually, it's a great opportunity to seize that. And I think people are probably noticed their mental well-being is a little bit further down than it usually would have been. Therefore, actually, everybody is exposed to it a bit more. So actually, great opportunity here. So actually, how do we equip people to learn and to manage their own mental health? And it sort of comes into this point that, my experience as a leader in the past was one, a bit like you, Richard, where I had very little understanding about mental health. Instinctively, I think I was quite a compassionate leader. So spent 10 years in the army leading relatively large teams of soldiers. But I assumed that the job of well-being or mental health was the job of the doctor, of the padre, of the welfare officer. I think now we just need to get to this point where people realize it is an extension of the function of leadership to understand, first of all, how I set the conditions for people to thrive individually, but also how I make things better by my own actions. Because in many cases, line managers are the problem. So it is about reflection. It is about humility and courage to be able to engage with this stuff. But I actually spend most of my time talking to police officers, leaders in police forces, and we talk about this idea of shared responsibility. Yes, there's lots that you can and maybe should be doing as a leader, but actually there's a lot that your team members can take more responsibility for. But you've got to give them the knowledge, the skills, the confidence, the reassurance, and the time and the space to be able to develop this stuff. Sorry, that was a bit of a belt fed.
Brilliant.
But I think it's. I mean, your point is coming back to the fact there's got to be a whole strategy. It's got to be everyone has a responsibility, everyone has a role to play, and everyone needs to know what their part is. So I spoke to someone recently who said, "Oh, I don't have much influence." And there's a quote I shared with someone about, try going to bed with a mosquito in your room, and you'll soon realise that something really small can have quite an impact. Everyone has a role to play, and I think we need to stop shifting the blame, whether that's kind of consciously or unconsciously. There was a big push a while ago to do resilience training. Let's make our employees more resilient. But then some companies will do that in a way that's, if we make them more resilient, we can throw more at them, and hopefully they'll just cope with it. And maybe their threshold for burnout will get higher and higher. So we can just keep throwing stuff at them. So actually, let's stop making them more resilient. Let's start looking at us as an organisation and how we support people to be able to be more themselves rather than having to put a kind of stronger face on.
And I think a lot of it is about decentralising knowledge. Problem with just training 1 in 10 as mental health first aiders is they've got pretty good skills, but they are isolated, they're siloed, and everybody else is still none the wiser.
Exactly.
But actually, far better to get a little bit of knowledge out to everybody than sort of keeping that siloed. The analogy that I use is more military. When we started getting more explosive victims in the Afghan war, we didn't get more doctors back in the base. Actually, we trained the young lads out on the team to actually deal with traumatic amputations, and the death rate plummeted because we equipped everybody with the knowledge and the skills and the ability to deal with this stuff at the lowest level.
And I think that is a really good point, but it's the training. When we think about managers, there's some data that suggests only 71% of employers, or as many as 71% of employers, don't train their first-time managers. So you become a first-time manager, suddenly responsible for other people with zero training. So how is that supposed to be setting that team up for any type of care, unless you happen to have someone who naturally is good at it? But even those people like yourself, Ollie, who are naturally compassionate, there are going to be gaps. And we need to start investing in manager training. When we ask managers who, how they got to where they are at now, 68% of them have been found in one study by Investors and People to be accidental. They've just ended up there. There was no career plan. There was no kind of development. So they suddenly end up being a manager without any of the awareness about how to identify who is struggling, about how to create a team environment based on psychological safety, empowerment, how to role model, how to do genuine check-ins, which are a bit more than "you're right, yeah, that's fine." If we don't invest in that, then we aren't setting them up to succeed. And we're still putting the pressure on them, because they're still under the same amount of pressure to look after their team, to deal with hybrid working, remote working, to spot when people aren't in a great place. And for me, it's not just around mental health and well-being, it's around the whole experience. So I might say, actually, my mental health is fine, and on a whole, I'm doing okay. But today I'm not having a great day because what's getting in the way for me today, and can I share that? Can I have a conversation? So I think for me, we need to focus on the bit around managers. Do they understand basic mental health and well-being? Do they understand what people need in order to thrive, like what our basic emotional needs are? So kind of a very, very fundamental level. Do they understand, I use an iceberg analogy a lot. So what they're seeing in their teammates is just the tip of the iceberg. Do they really know what's going on underneath? And there was a question that came up in I was talking on a Thames Valley Chamber of Commerce webinar a couple of weeks ago, and someone talked about the fact that they got, I think it was them, or one of their team, is being triggered by news of what's going on in Afghanistan, and so and it was really impacting on their ability to focus at work. So how many managers know what their backgrounds are of the people in their team, and who's struggling with what, which might not be anything to do with the job? But unless we know what's going on underneath the iceberg, unless we know the impact of high emotional arousal on our ability to engage and to perform, and an ability to relate with people, unless we know how to have conversations, the right people to have conversations with, and how to do check-ins and feel confident about it, and to look after my own well-being as a manager, because it's no good me being stressed and trying to look after my team, because that's never going to work. We're not going to get this right. So for me, the number one thing is investing in that level within a company.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great point, Bolly. And I'm really disappointed that you didn't use any sporting analogies, but I'm sure I can weave a few more in. On the chat feed, Mark's just raised the question, really, that kind of we're all here to kind of learn more. Where do we get more information? Amanda's shared some links around ACAS. I guess from the point of today's kind of non-webinar, it wasn't about us kind of necessarily delivering a load of information. It was more around open discussion around the current climate, our desire that we don't want to see the continuation of those frontline managers being beaten up, if you like. So Lisa came up with the great idea to kind of put the boxing gloves on the kind of the advert for this non-webinar. And really that was focused around kind of when we work with organisations, we do see that thread that these frontline managers, these kind of people with frontline responsibility for groups of people, are effectively being beaten up themselves. And it, as Lisa said, focusing on the individual. So time-wise, we've probably got another 10 minutes in the can on this one, and I really appreciate everyone's time and kind of sticking on with us. I think
we have more questions before that, Richard. So what I'll do is I'll punch you out the ring again. We had Jill with her hand up first. So Jill, what would you like to share, please?
Awesome.
I think it's back to the same thing. We talked about health and safety is being everybody's responsibility, and the same as mental health is everybody's responsibility. So if you see a colleague that's not doing well, we all should support them. But I think what businesses and organizations can do is help the individuals look at what looks good for them. So look at how do you manage your own mental health or your own well-being? What do you need to be able to cope? And it is little things. Will be maybe you need to take a walk when things get stressful. Maybe you need to take a break, and it's about having organizations that help those individuals work out what it is that they need and make sure that that is able to be delivered in an organization. I certainly have within my network somebody who has attention deficit disorder, and they need to have breaks. They suffer with severe fatigue, and if they don't have regular breaks within their day, and that is non-sensory breaks, they need to go away and have a quiet room, their whole world falls apart. But within the organization that they were working in, they were being told, you have to work like this. You have to take this many phone calls, write your notes in this way, and no way can you take a 10 or 15-minute break. And it's those little tiny things will make a massive difference to one person. And it's about organization supporting each individual to know what it is that they need to help them manage their day, their week, and making sure that that organization supports that all the way through the organization. And it's about trust, and it's about creating a trust-based organizations where it's okay to say I'm not okay, and I think just saying it is not enough.
Yeah, where I've seen that work really well, Jill, is when people do that on an individual basis, and that's really important. But whereas a team, you also do that. So yes, I'm a fan of getting a scale, 0 to 10, and asking the team, what does good look like? If we're being together in a team, if we are feeling supported, if we are feeling that being at work is a great place to be, wherever that place is, and we're feeling connected and we're feeling safe, and it's okay to ask questions and to challenge and so on. What does a 10 look like? What's good looking like for us collectively? You have to do it collectively because we all have a perspective. And what does 0 look like? And then where do we think ourselves we are now as a team on that scale? And again, expect there to be difference depending on individual realities. And then you can start to look at, okay, what do we need as a team to be doing differently? And I think when also people in a team understand each other's needs, so I might, on my personal scale, I might need, or my personal strategies, I might need to go for a walk every half an hour. If my team know that, they can also be looking out for me. So it becomes a kind of collective caring rather than sort of responsibility. It's that sense of noticing each other's early warning signs. I talk to people when I'm talking about mental health well-being and knowing the signs and how to support and so on. Actually, most people don't know what their early warning signs are themselves, let alone actually sharing it with anyone else they work with, so that you can notice someone's looking a bit irritable or they don't sound okay, they're a bit quieter than normal, and checking that out rather than expecting the manager to always do that.
And I think that most people, surprisingly, when you go back and research it, a lot of people have coping mechanisms that they have themselves. They don't necessarily realize that they're coping mechanisms. If you're aware that it is a coping mechanism, maybe you go, when things get too stressful, you go and make cups of tea. If you're making a lot of cups of tea in an hour, that means that you're stressed. Yeah. It's that kind of thing. It's noticing those kind of things.
Thank you.
Definitely.
So can I come on to Roy, Richard?
Yeah, I was going to do exactly the same. So Roy, you've been very patiently waiting there, and James will jump to you after. So appreciate the patience, guys.
That's all right. That's very kind. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a really interesting discussion on a really important topic. I just wanted to highlight something and then point out a question to the speakers, please, both you, Richard and Lisa. I was advising a client, or I'm currently advising a client, who, in handing in his resignation, had told his manager, who was the CEO of a company, he said that his mental health had deteriorated, and all the hallmarks were there: sort of poor sleep, poor diet, much more drinking in terms of alcohol intake. And the manager's response to him was, mental health is a fad. I'll give you the polite version of what the manager said. Mental health is a fad. You need to man up and just kind of get on with it, really. And of course, it's no surprise that my client eventually left on the spot. But so my question to you is, how would you advise employees who may find themselves in this circumstance and resigning isn't necessarily an option for them, maybe because of financial pressure or otherwise?
Oh, Richard, were you going to say something?
I was going to say, what a great question. I don't know if I can answer it, because actually I think I've never actually used those words myself, but maybe 10 years ago I might have had that thought process myself, and that's an honest kind of product of our time kind of conversation. I think if we've got colleagues or clients that are in that situation, I think it's about helping them understand that is a toxic environment always right for them to stay at any cost, because they can't always change everything. Yes, they need to signpost and kind of play that picture out back to their leadership and back to their kind of business. You mentioned there that it was kind of at the exit interview kind of stage that it was raised. I guess my challenge would be that needs to be raised sooner. And if it's not taken on board properly, then that's just another indicator that toxic environment isn't right and needs to change. And it might not change straight away. There's many other things in society and in the workplace that needs a lot of work, and mental health and wellbeing is one of them, and people just need to keep speaking up, and making sure that it's voiced not just at the exit stage, because that's always a very toxic experience anyway. People are kind of giving you the keys back and telling you that it's rubbish to work here and all that sort of stuff. It needs to be.
I think I agree about it's really bad. I think I'd agree in terms of, actually, I always say to people, if it's that bad, then try and leave. If you can't change anything, if you try and change what you can, but if it's that toxic, is it really worth staying? But I would get well, this has happened before. I've advised employees to go and find someone else in their company who they do feel they can talk to, because people tend to leave work because of their manager or the person in charge of them, not the whole company. And so their manager might be someone who is contributing to that problem or causing that problem, whereas someone else will have a very different approach. And it might be that manager needs support, training, development, to change how they're behaving. It could be that, and I've seen it happen before, that people are moved to a slightly different team, where actually their strengths are better used anyway and have a better relationship, they're more supported. So there can be ways around it, but I would suggest is finding the right person to have the conversation with, and not just putting up with it and then exiting and then feeding back, as you said, Richard.
Great question though, and you know what? I wish there was a world we lived in where those situations didn't exist. But collectively, we can try and make a scratch on that. James, you've been super patient. I don't know if you're our last hand raised question, but please jump in, mate.
Yeah, no, thank you. I don't think I've been waiting as long as the others, because two things I just want to say. One is, the sorts of things that Jill and Tasha have been saying about, local colleagues, as it were, your workmates, whatever the situation is, supporting you in everyday things, like noticing you've got you're a bit grumpy this morning, or drinking more tea than normal, or whatever. I think that's really important. And I think probably we do that on a human level anyway. But the other point I want to make is that, and Lisa knows a little bit about this, that I've noticed in my local supermarket of a major store, grocery store, that some of the staff have not been as customer friendly as they would expect them to be, or even the individuals want to be. But the background to this is that there's a lot of reorganization going on across the company in the management level, both at the store level and the head of HQ, as far as I understand it. So it suggests that maybe you need sort of a task force, as it were, when there's particular situations going on in an organization to support this. I'm not disputing the ongoing thing at all, but maybe opportunities or situations where that becomes particularly pertinent at a certain time.
I think companies have got to be open to that, haven't they? We know that, well, some data suggests that poor managers, so there's accidental managers who don't necessarily have the skills, have a real impact on their employees, and that then has a direct impact on what clients, what customers experience. Some of the stats around that are poor managers can account for low mood in their teams 24% of the time, stress 15% of the time, poor engagement 14% of the time. There's some pretty big stats around the direct impact of a manager on their team. And if your team's feeling stressed or has got their mood is low, it's going to directly impact on the customers, on the clients.
Absolutely, and we'll come to Jill in a minute for the final hand raise, and then we'll close off. But I think, James, you're absolutely right. I mean, we've probably got 2 new subjects we could do a non-webinar on. One is around trust, and James, the other one there you just mentioned is around the impact on organisations when they go through significant change. And we've seen that with a range of our clients. And that significant change, I mean, the pandemic obviously was a major one for everybody, but it could be a change of pension, it could be a restructure, it could be some other difficult business decisions taking place. So really good point to put out there. Jill, you've been patient with your hand. We'll let you have the last hand raised.
Sorry, I think I didn't take it down, or I pressed the button by accident, but I'm always happy to contribute.
Well, can I ask you another question? Because there was another question that came up.
Absolutely.
About empathy, and can we teach empathy? Do you mind, Jill, if I just answer that question, because that's in the chat box? And I think there's some evidence that suggests that people either are more empathetic than others. So you'll have some people who you can go on a course and you can try and learn about empathy, and it still they are not going to be the best people at that. But I think everyone can learn more about empathy by just having some experience where they actually have time to focus on it. What does empathy actually really mean? What does it look like? What are the behaviours that communicate empathy? What, non-verbal and verbal? What do we need to be doing, and what do we need to be noticing? And so the kind of what does empathy actually mean, and how do we see that on a day-to-day basis? And I think there's lots to be said around emotional intelligence as a whole. I think when we focus a little bit more on the basic skills that are needed for people to be able to have really good conversations and be able to connect with each other and feel safe with each other, we go a long way. So I
think that's really interesting, Lisa. Sorry, because I was the one to ask that question. I have read just Simon Baron-Cohen's book on 0 degrees empathy. So, the bell curve is there, and there will be people at either extreme. But I think one of the big challenges for corporations and organisations is to try and identify whose managerial strengths play to that particular role in supporting those conversations, because we have to accept as a matter of fact that the population will include 2 or 3% of people, potentially more, depending on how high you are up in an organisation, that empathy will not be there. And of course, if you're trying to further a better culture, a more inclusive, supportive culture, then you could damage that by choosing the wrong people. But equally, you shouldn't write anyone off either. So it's quite a difficult challenge for organisations.
Yeah, and I think for me, I talk to leadership a lot about flattening the hierarchy, or to rethinking how we think about development and promotion, rather than expecting everyone to be able to be promoted and to develop their role to have to be a manager. If they don't have the necessary skill sets or confidence to be able to do that well, then actually they'd be better off not being a manager of people and being able to be progressed in a different way, so that they can still have that sense of status and achievement and development without having to take on a role that doesn't really fit them.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. That by the way, wasn't a alarm going at the end of the hour. That was my Ring doorbell. So I've just had one of those embarrassing Zoom call moments. But actually, it was bang on the hour. So whoever's just delivered me a parcel from Amazon, thank you very much. You've given us the kind of the bell at the end. I guess I want to respect everyone's time, and it's been brilliant to have the conversation. Like all of these things, you kind of put out there that you want to have an engaged audience and have some questions back and forth, and then you kind of get worried that you're going to get staring at blank faces. So hugely appreciate the attendance, but also the questions and the comments in the chat. It's been brilliant to catch up with everybody. I'll let Lisa officially kind of finish and close. But thank you for your time, everybody. Please feel free to keep the conversation flowing. Let's all connect in whichever ways LinkedIn, you feel free to reach out to us. I'll put my email address in the chat column. Lisa can pop hers in there as well. And Lisa, I'll pass it on to you to close the event, but a huge thank you to everybody. It's been really enjoyable.
Thank you. Well, I'm not going to say very much because I think a lot's been said, other than I'd urge you all to go away and think about how you're consciously planning for organisation-wide cultural change and development, which is a very holistic approach to mental health and wellbeing, and getting it right for employees. It's around your values, around psychological safety, empowerment, positive recognition, as well as the sort of, the prevention of mental health and wellbeing problems, as well as how to address them when they arise. Invest in your manager training and try it out. Go and have a conversation with someone. Think about who in your team you just go and have a conversation with today to find out how they're doing, with no other agenda. No kind of like, I just want to check up on how you're getting on with that particular client or that piece of work. Just how are you? And then maybe email Richard and I and let us know kind of actually what the response was. How did they respond when you just genuinely showed that you cared? And how did it feel for you reaching out to that person? Because I think when we start having the quality conversations, that makes a significant difference. That gets the ball rolling. So thank you ever so much to everybody. Fantastic to have the conversation. It's an hour's not long enough. But yeah, do keep the conversation going with us. Connect with us on LinkedIn, give us a call, email, whatever's easiest, but keep the conversation going. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.